3 weeks after the discovery of the empty worlds, the Galactic Council was still searching for answers and finding none. Every ship, every probe, every scanning device the elder races possessed had been pointed at human space, and all of them returned the same result. Nothing. No trail, no energy signatures, no warp residue, no ion exhaust. No evidence of any kind that 8 billion people had moved anywhere at all. It was as though humanity had simply been erased from the universe, like a word wiped from a page. Vorath assigned the investigation to a Cathari intelligence officer named Sithara. She was brilliant, methodical, and deeply suspicious of easy answers. She had spent her career analyzing threats and identifying patterns that others missed, and Vorath believed that if anyone could find the truth, it was her. He gave her full access to every human archive, database, and communication relay that the fleet had recovered from the abandoned worlds. Sithara spent the first week simply reading. She read military reports, civilian communications, scientific papers, personal letters, news articles, and government records. She read millions of documents, working through them with the tireless focus that her species was known for. And by the end of that first week, she understood something that made her stomach turn cold. The humans had not run. There was no panic in any of the records, no emergency broadcasts, no tearful goodbyes, no desperate scramble to board evacuation ships. Instead, what she found was calm, organized, methodical, almost cheerful calm. The final weeks of human civilization on their worlds read like the last days before a long-planned vacation. People had wrapped up their work. They had closed their accounts. They had said goodbye to their homes with the easy sadness of someone who knows they are going somewhere better. Sithara presented her findings to the council chamber. She stood before the 12 elder races and told them what she believed. Humanity had not been caught off guard by the council's strike. They had known it was coming, probably for years, and they had used that time not to build weapons or defenses, but to prepare a departure so complete and so perfectly coordinated that it defied everything the council understood about logistics, communication, and physics. She told them that the humans appeared to have developed a form of translocation technology that left no residual energy trail. She could not explain how it worked. She could only point to the evidence of its results. The science divisions of 3 elder races reviewed her data and declared it theoretically impossible. She simply asked them to explain where the humans had gone. None of them could. And then the strange things started happening. It began small. On the Torvani border world of Kes 4, a military listening post lost power for exactly 11 minutes. When the systems came back online, everything appeared normal except for one thing. Every piece of data related to human weapons research had been erased from the station's core memory. Not corrupted, not damaged, erased cleanly and completely, as though it had never existed. The staff on duty at the time remembered nothing unusual. They had not even noticed the power failure until the logs were reviewed afterward. A week later, on the Drenai trade hub of Palak Station, a cargo merchant named Gora found something embedded in the wall of his storage bay. It was a small metallic disc, no larger than a coin, made of a material that no one could identify. When Cathari scientists examined it, they discovered it was broadcasting a signal. The signal was faint, but steady. And it was aimed not at any location in normal space, but into a direction that the scientists could not map. It was broadcasting into somewhere else, somewhere that did not appear on any chart or sensor reading they had. The signal contained a message. It was in human English, repeating on a loop, and it said, "We remember what you chose." The council tried to keep these incidents quiet. Vorath ordered a full media blackout and instructed all military commanders to classify any unusual events as routine technical failures. But the incidents kept coming, and they kept getting harder to explain away. On a Cathari research station, deep in their home territory, a sealed laboratory was found open one morning. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been damaged, but someone had left a single object on the central workbench. It was a human children's toy, a small stuffed animal in the shape of a bear. It had a tag attached to it with a handwritten note that read, "This belonged to a girl named Katie. She was 7 years old. She would have been in her bedroom when your ships arrived." The scientists who found it were deeply disturbed, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. The laboratory was located on a station that orbited the Cathari homeworld itself. It was protected by 3 layers of military security, biometric locks, and constant surveillance. No one had entered the room, no alarm had been triggered, no ship had approached the station, and yet the toy was there, sitting on the workbench, as though someone had simply walked in and placed it down. Vorath read the report and said nothing for a long time. Then he ordered every fleet in the Cathari Navy to return to defensive positions around the homeworld. The strike against humanity was officially shelved. There was, after all, nothing to strike. And whatever the humans had become, wherever they had gone, they clearly had the ability to reach places that should have been unreachable. The fear was spreading now, not just among the military leaders, but among ordinary citizens. Rumors leaked despite the media blackout. People whispered about ghost signals and impossible messages, and the idea that the humans were somehow everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Sithara continued her investigation, digging deeper into the recovered archives. She found a name that kept appearing in classified military files: Pete Harris. He had not been a soldier or a scientist. He had been a schoolteacher on the colony world of New Geneva. He had taught young children how to read and how to do basic mathematics, and by all accounts, he had been a quiet, gentle man who loved his work and loved his 2 daughters, Megan and Katie. His personal journal had been recovered from his home on New Geneva. It was mostly filled with ordinary things: notes about lesson plans, thoughts about his daughter's progress in school, observations about the weather and the neighbors and the small daily details of a simple life. But the final entry, written the night before the disappearance, was different. It was addressed to Megan and Katie. It read, "They think fear is a weapon only they can use. Tomorrow, we teach them otherwise. Pack light, girls. We are going somewhere they will never find us." Sithara read that entry several times. She thought about Pete Harris, a schoolteacher writing those words to his children on the last night before an entire species walked away from everything they had ever known. She thought about the confidence in those words. Not the confidence of a soldier or a leader, but the quiet confidence of a father who knew that his children were going to be safe. Who knew, with absolute certainty, that the most powerful military alliance in the galaxy could not touch them. She closed the journal and sat alone in her office for a long time. She thought about the Council's vote. She thought about the 300 warships that had been sent to destroy a civilization. She thought about the empty worlds, and the silent cities, and the meals left on tables, and the toys left in parks. And she thought about what kind of species could do what the humans had done. Not the technology, not the science, but the will, the decision, the ability to look at their entire history, their entire world, everything they had ever built, and say, "We will leave all of this behind before we let you turn us into killers." She had never encountered a species that responded to the threat of annihilation, not with rage, not with surrender, but with the calm, deliberate act of simply refusing to play the game. And that, she realized, was what frightened her most of all. 6 months had passed since the disappearance, and the Galactic Council was breaking apart. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way large things usually break. Slowly at first, with small cracks that nobody wanted to look at too closely, and then faster, until the cracks were everywhere and could no longer be ignored. The 12 elder races had stood together for over 1,000 years, bound by shared interests, and the comfortable belief that they were the rightful rulers of the galaxy. But humanity's vanishing act had shaken that belief to its foundation, and what was left underneath was not unity, it was blame. The Draenei Consortium fired the first shot, though they used words instead of weapons. The Draenei were a trade species. They had built their entire civilization on commerce, negotiation, and the movement of goods between worlds. And for the past 40 years, their most profitable trading partner had been humanity. Human worlds consumed Draenei luxury goods, raw materials, and technology components at a rate that no other species could match. Human engineers, in return, had designed and built some of the most efficient transport ships in the galaxy, vessels that the Draenei used to move their cargo faster and cheaper than ever before. All of that was gone now. The human worlds were empty. The trade routes were dead. The Draenei economy had contracted by nearly 40% in 6 months, and their people were angry. Consortium leader Tav Olesi stood before the council chamber and spoke with a fury that surprised even those who knew him well. He pointed directly at Vorath and accused the Cathari of dragging the entire galaxy into a catastrophe for no reason other than jealousy and paranoia. The humans, he said, had been the most economically productive species any of them had ever encountered. They had been creative, energetic, endlessly inventive, and willing to trade with anyone who treated them fairly, and the council had voted to destroy them. Not because they had attacked anyone, not because they had broken any law, but because they were growing too fast and making the elder races feel insecure. Vorath responded with cold anger. He reminded Olesi that the Draenei had voted in favor of the strike, along with everyone else. Olesi did not deny it. He said he had been a fool to listen to Cathari fear-mongering, and he would not make that mistake again. The argument lasted for hours. Other species joined in, some taking the Draenei side, others defending the Cathari position. By the end of the session, no resolution had been reached, and 3 species had formally requested a review of the original vote. It was the first time in council history that a unanimous decision had been challenged by its own members. Meanwhile, the incidents in council space continued to escalate. On the Cathari homeworld itself, something happened that Vorath could not hide from the public, no matter how hard he tried. Every public display screen in the capital city of Vethran, every billboard, every transit information panel, every advertising screen in every shop and restaurant simultaneously went dark for 5 seconds. And then they all lit up with the same message, written in perfect Cathari script. The message read, "You voted to kill our children. We counted every hand that was raised." The message stayed on the screens for exactly 30 seconds. Then everything returned to normal. The technical teams that examined the systems afterward found no intrusion, no hack, no foreign signal, and no explanation. It was as though the screens had simply decided on their own to display those words. Panic swept through the Cathari population. Citizens flooded government communication channels, demanding answers. Vorath appeared on public broadcasts and assured his people that the situation was under control, that the message was likely a leftover automated program from human intelligence networks, and that there was no evidence of any active human presence in council space. Most people did not believe him. The fear in his eyes was too obvious for even the most loyal citizen to miss. Scythara, the intelligence officer leading the investigation, had by now assembled a small team of analysts from multiple species. They worked in a secure facility on Cathari Prime, going through every piece of recovered human data they could find, trying to understand what humanity had built and where they had gone. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A decoded file extracted from a relay satellite near the Orion Nebula contained personnel records from a human research facility. Among them was a file belonging to a woman named Laura Price. She had been a civilian engineer who specialized in deep space communication arrays. Her work was unremarkable on the surface, the kind of quiet technical work that rarely attracted attention. But her file contained a note, flagged by human military intelligence, that changed everything Sithara thought she understood. The note read, "Dr. Price's theoretical work on subdimensional signaling has been reclassified to Black Horizon clearance. All further correspondence must be routed through Project Ember." Project Ember. Sithara had seen the name before, scattered in fragments across dozens of recovered files. It appeared in budget documents with no listed purpose. It appeared in personnel transfers with no listed destination. It appeared in encrypted communications that referenced timelines and milestones, but never explained what was actually being built. It was a ghost in the data, present everywhere, but visible nowhere. Sithara's team spent weeks piecing together every fragment they could find. What emerged was not a complete picture, but it was enough to make them understand the scale of what humanity had done. Project Ember was not a weapon. It was not a shield. It was not a ship, or a station, or a fleet. It was something entirely different. Something that operated on principles that the Council's best scientists could barely comprehend. The fragments suggested it was a doorway of some kind, a way of accessing a place that did not exist in normal space, and the humans had been building it in secret for over 20 years. While the Council had been watching human military movements and counting human warships and measuring human weapons, the humans had been building something else entirely, something invisible, something the Council's entire surveillance network had never detected because they had never known to look for it. Another name surfaced in the Project Ember files: Sam Brady. He had been a captain in the United Earth Navy, a decorated officer who had served with distinction in several border skirmishes before retiring from active service. His file showed that after retirement, he had been quietly reassigned as the military liaison for Project Ember during what the documents called its final phase. Sithara's team found a single voice recording attributed to Brady, recovered from a hidden data cache buried deep inside a storage facility on Titan, one of Saturn's moons. The recording was short. Brady's voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had seen enough of the galaxy to know exactly what he was saying. He said, "The Council thinks we are animals backed into a corner. They have no concept of what a species does when it decides the cage itself is the problem. We are not running from them. We are leaving them behind." Sithara played that recording for the Council. She watched their faces as they listened. She saw the Draenei representatives exchange worried glances. She saw the Torvani military officers sit up straighter in their seats. She saw Vorath's compound eyes go very still. She told them her conclusion. Humanity had known for years that the Council would eventually try to destroy them. And instead of preparing for war, they had prepared an exit. They had built a door to somewhere else, somewhere the Council could not follow. And they had walked through it with every single member of their species. The incidents across Council space, the erased data, the mysterious signals, the messages on screens, those were not automated leftovers. They were deliberate, controlled, precise. Someone was sending them. Someone who could reach into the most secure facilities in the galaxy without being seen. The humans were not gone. They were right here. They were everywhere. And they were watching. The Council chamber fell silent. For the first time in 1,000 years, the elder races of the galaxy looked at each other and saw not wisdom, not strength, not the steady confidence of species that had ruled the stars for millennia. They saw uncertainty. They saw doubt. And behind it all, growing louder with every passing day, they heard a question that none of them wanted to answer. What happens when the species you tried to destroy turns out to be more powerful than you ever imagined, and the only reason you are still alive is because they chose to let you be? 1 year to the day after humanity disappeared, a ship appeared at the edge of Council space. It did not arrive through hyperspace. There was no flash of light, no ripple of energy, no warning from any sensor array or listening post. One moment there was empty space, dark and quiet and unremarkable. The next moment, something was there. Something so large that when the nearest Torvani patrol fleet detected it, the sensor officer on duty stared at his screen for a full 10 seconds before he believed what he was seeing. The object was roughly spherical, smooth and dark, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had no visible engines, no weapon arrays, no docking ports, no hull plating in any configuration that matched any known species design language. It was approximately the size of a small moon. It sat motionless in space, silent and vast and utterly impossible. The patrol fleet commander sent an emergency alert to Sathari Prime. Within the hour, every major military force in Council space was on full alert. Warships from 6 species changed course and moved toward the object. Vorath, who had grown visibly older and more tired in the year since the disappearance, convened an emergency council session. Before the council could even begin its debate, the object broadcast a message. It came on every frequency simultaneously, in every known council language, transmitted with a clarity and precision that suggested the sender understood their communications technology better than they did themselves. The message said, "We are ready to talk. Send one representative. Unarmed. Alone." The council argued for 3 days. Vorath wanted to send a military officer who could assess the object's defensive capabilities. Tav Olesi of the Drenai wanted to send a diplomat who could begin trade negotiations. Admiral Caldera of the Torvani military suggested sending no one at all, and instead firing on the object with everything they had. His suggestion was quickly voted down when Sithara quietly reminded the chamber that if the humans could place a stuffed bear inside a sealed Cathari laboratory without triggering a single alarm, they could probably survive a few missiles. In the end, they chose a compromise. Advisor Lenara Kess was a Celian, a member of a small, neutral species known throughout the galaxy for 2 things: their powerful empathic abilities and their long history of mediating disputes between larger civilizations. The Celians had not voted on the strike against humanity because they held no seat on the council. They had no military, no territorial ambitions, and no history of conflict with humans. If anyone could walk into that object and come back alive, it was a Celian. Lenara accepted the assignment without hesitation. She was tall for her species, with pale silver skin and large dark eyes that gave her a look of permanent thoughtfulness. She had mediated over 40 interspecies disputes in her career, and she had a reputation for being impossible to rattle. She boarded a small, unarmed shuttle, crossed the empty space between the Council fleet and the Dark Sphere, and passed through an opening in the surface that appeared as she approached and closed behind her after she entered. What she found inside stopped her in her tracks. The interior of the object was not a ship. It was a world. She stepped out of her shuttle into open air, warm and clean, carrying the scent of grass and running water. Above her was a sky, blue and bright, with clouds drifting slowly across it. She knew it could not be a real sky, that she was inside a structure floating in space. But every one of her senses told her it was real. The sunlight felt warm on her skin. Birds she did not recognize sang in trees she had never seen before. Before her stretched a landscape of rolling green hills, crossed by rivers that sparkled in the light. In the distance, she could see cities. Not the cramped utilitarian structures of a refugee camp or a hastily built colony, but beautiful soaring cities that floated above the landscape on platforms of light. They were connected by bridges that shimmered like captured rainbows, and surrounded by energy fields that pulsed gently with a soft, warm glow. She could see people moving through those cities, millions of people, living, working, laughing, raising children, building lives. Humans, all of them. A woman was waiting for her at the bottom of the shuttle ramp. She was of average height, with short brown hair and steady dark eyes, and the kind of face that suggested she smiled often, but was not smiling now. She extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, and Lenara took it. "My name is Amy Grant," the woman said. "I speak for the human continuity. Welcome to our home." Lenara asked what the human continuity was. Amy explained as they walked together through a garden path toward one of the floating cities. She said it was not a government in the way the council understood governments. There was no president, no parliament, no military chain of command. The human continuity was a collective decision-making body, guided by consensus and represented by speakers chosen for their ability to listen rather than their desire to lead. Amy had been chosen as the speaker for external contact because she had spent her career before the disappearance as a conflict resolution specialist. Lenara asked the question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. What had happened? Where had they gone? How had they done it? Amy told her everything. Humanity had known about the Council's planned strike for over 2 years. Their intelligence networks were deeper and more sophisticated than the elder races had ever suspected. They had intercepted the proposal for the strike before it was even formally submitted to the Council for a vote. They had watched the debates. They had listened to the arguments. They had heard every word Vorath had said about them. And they had made a decision. They would not fight. They would not beg. They would not try to negotiate with a body that had already decided they deserved to die. Instead, they would leave. Amy told Lenara about Project Ember. It had begun over 20 years before the disappearance, started by a small team of physicists who had discovered something remarkable. There was a layer of reality that existed alongside normal space, a parallel dimension with its own physics, its own energy, and its own vast, uninhabited territory. The humans called it the substrate. It was not another planet or another star system. It was another version of reality itself, folded against the one the Council inhabited, like a page pressed against another page in a book. The first experiments had been small, sending objects into the substrate and bringing them back, then sending people, then building structures. Over 2 decades, working in absolute secrecy, under the cover of ordinary military and civilian research programs, the humans had built an entire civilization inside the substrate. Cities, farms, forests, oceans, schools and hospitals and parks, and everything a species needed to live. They had prepared a new home, piece by piece, year by year, while the Council watched their surface activities and believed they understood everything about them. When the Council authorized the strike, the humans activated the final phase of Project Ember. In less than 72 hours, every man, woman, and child on every human world walked through the gateway into the substrate. They took their pets, their personal belongings, their cultural treasures, their seeds and soil, and everything they needed to continue their civilization. And then they closed the door behind them and watched from the other side as 300 warships arrived to find empty rooms and cooling meals and silence. Lenara listened to all of this with the deep attention her species was known for. She could feel Amy's emotions through her empathic abilities. There was no anger there, which surprised her, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. What she felt instead was something more complex. A deep sadness, the kind that comes from having lost faith in something you once hoped could be better. And underneath that sadness, something strong and unwavering and absolutely certain. Lenara asked what the humans wanted now. Amy stopped walking. They had reached the edge of one of the floating cities, and below them, the green landscape stretched out in every direction, dotted with the lights of smaller settlements, and crossed by silver rivers. Amy looked out at the world her species had built inside a dimension that the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed. And she spoke carefully. She said the humans wanted the Council to understand three things. First, the technology that allowed them to access the substrate also allowed them to project force into normal space from a position of total safety. They could strike any target in Council space without ever becoming visible or vulnerable. They could have fought the Council's fleet and won. This was not a guess. This was a fact. Second, they had chosen not to fight. They had chosen to leave. They had chosen mercy, not because they were weak, but because they refused to become the thing the Council had accused them of being. They refused to prove Vorath right. And third, if the Council ever moved against humanity again, the humans would not disappear a second time. Amy let that last point settle in the air between them. Lenara understood what it meant. She understood the weight of it, the quiet finality. It was not a threat spoken in anger. It was a boundary drawn by a species that had already shown it would rather abandon everything it had ever built than become violent. And that made the boundary more real, more unbreakable than any weapon could have made it. We did not disappear because we were afraid, Amy said. We disappeared because we refused to let you force us into becoming what you already believed we were. Lenara nodded slowly. She looked out at the human world, at the cities of light and the green hills and the millions of people living in a place that should not have existed. And she felt something she had never felt in all her years of diplomacy. She felt awe. Lenara returned to the council chamber on Cithari Prime, and every seat in the great circular room was filled. Representatives from all 12 elder races, their advisors, their military commanders, and their intelligence officers sat in silence as the small Celian diplomat walked to the center of the floor and began to speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She simply told them what she had seen and what she had been told, and she let the truth do its own work. She described the world inside the human vessel, the floating cities, the green landscapes, the millions of people living full, organized, thriving lives in a dimension the Council did not know existed. She described Amy Grant, the speaker for the human continuity, and the quiet certainty with which she had explained what the humans had built and why they had built it. And then she told them about the three things Amy had said. Lenara explained that the humans possessed the ability to strike any target in Council space from within the substrate without ever entering normal space themselves. They could not be tracked, targeted, or hit in return. She said she had seen no weapons during her visit, but Amy had been clear that the capability existed and was fully operational. Lenara said she believed her, not because of any evidence she could point to, but because her empathic abilities had detected no deception in anything Amy had said during their entire conversation. The second thing landed harder. The humans had chosen not to use that capability. They had watched the Council's warships arrive at their empty worlds and had done nothing. They had the power to destroy the fleet and had let it orbit their abandoned cities in confusion. They had chosen restraint, not out of weakness, not out of inability, but as a deliberate moral decision. They had refused to become what Vorath and the Council had accused them of being. The third thing landed hardest of all. If the Council ever moved against them again, the humans would not leave a second time. Lenara let the silence hold for a long moment after that. Then she continued. She said that before she left the human vessel, Amy Grant had taken her to one more place. It was a room deep within the floating city, below the residential levels and the parks and the schools. The room was large and quiet and filled with screens. Dozens of them, covering every wall, each one displaying a live feed from somewhere in Council space. Lenara had recognized what she was seeing almost immediately. One screen showed the Cathari Military Command Center on Vethran. Another showed the Torvani Fleet Headquarters. Another showed a classified Draenei research station that was supposedly known only to the highest-ranking members of the consortium. Screen after screen displayed the most sensitive, most protected, most secret locations in the entire galaxy. All of them being watched in real time by humans sitting in comfortable chairs in a dimension the Council could not reach. Amy had pointed to one particular screen. It showed the Council chamber itself, the very room where Lenara was now standing. It showed the empty seats, the curved walls, the great seal of the Galactic Council embedded in the floor. Amy had looked at Lenara and said, with a voice that carried no pride and no menace, only a simple, absolute clarity, "We are not asking for permission to exist. We are informing you that we do." Lenara finished her report and stepped back from the center of the chamber. The silence that followed was the deepest she had ever experienced in a political setting. No one moved. No one whispered to their neighbor. Every being in that room was processing the same realization at the same time, and it was not a comfortable thing to process. Vorath was the first to speak. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the commanding tone he had used for years. He asked Lenara to clarify the military situation. He wanted to know, in practical terms, what would happen if the Council chose to reject the humans' position. Lenara looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said that from everything she had observed, the humans could disable every ship in the Council fleet without ever appearing on their sensors. She said they could shut down planetary defense grids, erase military databases, and cripple communications networks across the entire galaxy. And they could do all of it from a place where no Council weapon could touch them. She said this not as a threat, because she was not threatening anyone. She said it as a simple observation of what she believed to be true. Tavalesi of the Draenei spoke next. He asked if the humans were willing to resume trade relations. Lenara said they were, but only under terms that recognized humanity as a fully sovereign civilization, with the absolute right to exist without preconditions, without oversight, and without the approval of any external body. The humans were not asking to join the Council. They were not asking for a seat at the table. They were stating that they had their own table, and anyone who wanted to sit at it was welcome to do so as an equal. Admiral Caldera asked the question that hung over everything else in the room like a shadow. He asked what would happen if the Council simply said no, if they refused to recognize humanity, if they declared the substrate a threat, and attempted to find a way to breach it. She could feel the weight of every eye in the chamber on her, and she chose her next words with the same care she had used in every negotiation of her career. She told them that she believed the humans did not want conflict. Everything they had done, from building the substrate refuge to leaving their worlds peacefully, to sending those strange messages across Council space, all of it pointed to a species that was trying very hard to resolve this situation without violence. But she also told them that she had felt something in Amy Grant during their conversation. Underneath the calm, underneath the diplomacy, underneath the careful, measured words, there was a line, a boundary that the humans had drawn inside themselves, beyond which they would not retreat. They had already given up their homeworld. They had already given up their history, their cities, their graves, every physical place that had ever mattered to them. They had given up everything they could give up. There was nothing left to take from them, and a species with nothing left to lose, and the power to project force across dimensions, was not a species that any sane civilization would want to provoke. The Council voted that evening. The motion to formally recognize humanity as a sovereign equal, with all the rights and protections that status carried, passed with 10 votes in favor and 2 against. Vorath cast his vote against recognition. A representative from a minor allied species called the Vec also voted no. Everyone else voted yes. 3 days later, Vorath resigned his position as High Chancellor of the Cathari Dominion. He issued a short statement saying that he was stepping down for personal reasons, and that he wished his successor well. He was never seen in public again. Some said he retreated to a private estate on a remote Cathari colony world. Others said he simply could not bear to live in a galaxy where the species he had tried to destroy now held more power than his own. No one ever confirmed which story was true. Over the following months, humanity began to emerge from the substrate. They did not return to their old worlds. When asked about this, Amy Grant explained that those places belonged to a version of humanity that no longer existed. The people who had walked through the gateway a year ago were not the same people who had left. They had been changed by the experience, not just technologically, but in the way they saw themselves and their place in the universe. They had let go of the need to prove themselves to anyone. Instead, they established new colonies in unclaimed space, far from Council territory. They built these new worlds with substrate-enhanced technology that made everything they had created before look primitive. Cities that floated without visible support. Energy systems that drew power from the boundary between dimensions. Communication networks that operated instantaneously across any distance. Medical technology that the elder races could barely comprehend. Nick Torres was a young engineer from the colony of Freeport. He had been 19 years old when the disappearance happened, old enough to understand what was at stake, and young enough to feel the full excitement of walking into a new world. He was among the first humans to set foot on a planet the continuity named Ember, after the project that had saved them all. When a Draenei journalist asked him how it felt to walk under an open sky again after a year inside another dimension, he smiled and said, "The sky was always open. You just could not see where we were standing." The galaxy changed after that. Slowly, the way all real change happens, but irreversibly. The Draenei were the first to establish full trade relations with the new human colonies. Within a year, their economy had not only recovered, but had grown beyond anything they had experienced before. Human technology, human creativity, and human energy poured into the galactic market, and every species that embraced the partnership prospered. The Torvani Military Council quietly dissolved its offensive fleet command and restructured around defensive operations. Admiral Caldera retired with full honors and spent his remaining years writing a detailed account of the disappearance and its aftermath. In it, he wrote that the greatest military failure in galactic history was not the empty strike against Earth. It was the failure to understand that strength does not always look like a fist. Sometimes it looks like an open door. The Cathari Dominion struggled the most. They had been the architects of the strike, the loudest voice calling for humanity's destruction, and the shame of that decision hung over them like a storm cloud that would not pass. It took a generation for them to fully reconcile with the new reality, and even then, there were those among them who could not accept that a species they had once dismissed as primitive had outmaneuvered the oldest civilization in the galaxy without firing a single shot. Sithara, the intelligence officer who had led the investigation, eventually left Cathari service and became an independent scholar. She wrote extensively about Project Ember and the disappearance, and her work became required reading at military academies across Council space. In her most famous lecture, delivered to a packed auditorium on Sithari Prime, she said, "We spent 1,000 years building a civilization based on the idea that power means control. The humans showed us that real power is the ability to walk away from everything and build something better. We were not ready for that lesson, but we needed it." In the deepest archives of the human continuity, kept in a quiet building in the heart of the first city built inside the substrate, Amy Grant recorded a final entry into the official historical record of what the humans simply called the departure. She wrote it herself, by hand, on paper, because some things she believed should be set down the old way. It read, "They built a council of elders and called it wisdom. They gathered their fleets and called it strength. They voted to end us and called it peace. And when we left, when we showed them that their power over us had always been an illusion, they called it impossible. But we have never been limited by what others call possible. We are human. We build doors where there are only walls, and we walk through them." She closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside the other records of human history. Outside the window, the lights of the floating city glowed softly against the substrate sky, and somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. The sound carried on the warm air, clear and bright and unafraid, the sound of a species that had looked extinction in the face and answered it not with violence, not with surrender, but with something far more powerful. They had answered it with the quiet, unshakable belief that they deserved to exist. The Galactic Council had been watching humanity for a very long time. For nearly 70 years, the 12 elder races had kept their eyes on the small blue planet and the noisy, restless species that called it home. They watched as the humans spread beyond their own world. They watched as they built colonies on Mars, then on the moons of Jupiter, then on planets circling distant stars. And with every new colony, every new ship, every new piece of technology the humans invented, the elder races grew a little more afraid. They did not call it fear, of course. They called it concern. They called it caution. They called it the responsible management of galactic stability. But underneath all those careful words, it was fear. Pure and simple. The humans were growing too fast, thinking too boldly, and building things that the elder races did not fully understand. And that made them dangerous. High Chancellor Vorath of the Cathari Dominion was the one who finally said what many had been thinking for years. He stood before the great circular chamber on Cathari Prime, his tall insectoid body clicking softly as he moved. And he laid out his case in a voice that carried absolute certainty. Humanity, he said, was a threat to the natural order. They were aggressive, unpredictable, and incapable of accepting their place in the galaxy. If the Council did not act now, while they still had the advantage, they would lose the chance forever. The vote was unanimous. All 12 elder races raised their support for a preemptive military strike against Earth, and all 37 human colony worlds. It was, they told themselves, an act of peace. A necessary measure to protect the galaxy from a species that would surely destroy it if left unchecked. 300 warships were assembled from 5 allied species. It was the largest fleet ever gathered under a single council directive. Torvani battlecruisers, Cathari carrier ships, Drenai heavy frigates, and support vessels from 2 smaller allied races formed a wall of metal and firepower that stretched across an entire sector of space. Admiral Rin Caldera, a Torvani officer with over 60 years of service, was given command of the combined fleet. He was old, experienced, and utterly without sentiment. He had fought in 3 border wars and had never lost a campaign. He was the perfect choice for what the Council expected to be a swift and total operation. The fleet moved through hyperspace in tight formation, arriving at the edge of the Sol system on what should have been the last day of human civilization. Caldera gave the order to advance. Sensors swept ahead, scanning for defense platforms, orbital stations, and military vessels. The fleet was ready for resistance. They were ready for weapons fire, for desperate counterattacks, for the chaos of a species fighting for survival. What they found was silence. Earth was there, exactly where it had always been, blue and green and wrapped in white clouds, spinning slowly in the light of its yellow star. The cities were visible from orbit. The satellites were still circling in their usual paths. Power grids were still running. Communication relays were still active. Everything looked exactly as it should have looked. But there were no people. Caldera ordered a ground team to the surface. He led it himself, which was unusual for a fleet admiral. But something about the silence made him uneasy in a way he could not explain. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. They landed in the city the humans called New York. It was enormous. Towers of glass and steel rose up on every side, catching the sunlight and throwing long shadows across wide streets. The air was clean. Birds were singing somewhere in the distance. A gentle wind moved through the empty avenues, pushing scraps of paper along the sidewalks. But there was no one there. Caldera walked through the streets for over an hour. He found meals left on tables in restaurants, still sitting on plates, as though the diners had simply stood up and walked away. He found vehicles stopped in the middle of roads, their doors closed, their engines cold. He found a park where children's toys lay scattered on the grass, and a school where books were still open on desks, and a hospital where machines still beeped softly in empty rooms. 8 billion human beings had vanished, not just from Earth, but from every colony, every station, every outpost in human space. The team sent to Mars found the same thing. The team sent to the Jupiter stations found the same thing. The team sent to New Geneva and Freeport and the other colony worlds found the same thing. Empty buildings, running systems, and not a single living human anywhere. Caldera stood in the middle of a New York street and looked up at the sky. He was a soldier who had faced death many times and had never felt truly afraid. But standing in that empty city, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life that had simply stopped, he felt something cold settle into his chest. This was not retreat. This was not defeat. This was something else entirely, and he did not have a word for it. Back on Cathari Prime, Vorath convened an emergency session of the Council. The mood in the chamber was very different from the confident certainty that had filled it just weeks before. The representatives of the elder races sat in their seats and stared at the reports coming in from the fleet. And for the first time in living memory, no one seemed to know what to say. The question was no longer how to destroy humanity. That plan was meaningless now. The question was where 8 billion people had gone, how they had moved without being detected, and most importantly, how they had known the strike was coming. The Council's vote had been conducted in the most secure chamber in the galaxy, behind layers of encryption and secrecy that were supposed to be unbreakable. A name surfaced in the recovered human military logs: Danny Cole. He had been a lieutenant commander in the United Earth Defense Corps, stationed aboard a command platform orbiting Jupiter. His last recorded transmission, dated 6 days before the fleet arrived, was short and clear. It read simply, "Relocation complete. All sectors confirmed dark. See you on the other side." 6 days before the fleet arrived. That meant the humans had finished their departure before the Council's warships had even entered hyperspace. They had not reacted to the attack. They had anticipated it. They had planned for it. And they had executed their plan with a precision and coordination that should have been impossible for a species the Council considered primitive. Vorath read Danny Cole's transmission 3 times. He focused on the last 5 words. "See you on the other side." He did not know what it meant. None of the Council's analysts knew what it meant. But those words, simple and calm and utterly without fear, made every elder race in the chamber feel something they had not felt in 1,000 years. They felt small. The greatest military force in galactic history had crossed the stars to crush a young species before it could become a threat. And that species had looked at the coming storm, packed its bags, and walked away, but with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew exactly what was going to happen and had decided long ago that they were not going to be there when it did. The empty worlds of humanity sat in perfect silence, waiting for no one. And somewhere, in a place the Council could not see, could not find, and could not even begin to understand, 8 billion human beings were watching, and they were patient.